Welcome to Hill Country Homilies, weekly homilies from St. Andrew Orthodox Church in Liberty Hill, Texas. St. Andrew's is an old calendar Orthodox church, sharing the faith of the apostles and the love of Christ with all who seek His truth. Now, let's listen to this week's homily.
Christ is risen.
Indeed, He is risen.
The first Sunday following Pascha is always celebrated as Thomas Sunday. And we read the Gospel. In the West, we often refer to Thomas as Doubting Thomas because of what we hear in the Gospel reading today. That when Thomas, who was absent when Christ first appeared to the disciples, is told that the Lord is risen, he proclaims to all of the other apostles that except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails and put my finger into the print of the nails and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And this phrase, Doubting Thomas, has taken on a colloquial meaning in our culture. When we refer to a Doubting Thomas, that's not really a good thing. We're not saying something positive about someone. It denotes someone who's skeptical, perhaps even when there's no need to be. Merriam-Webster defines a Doubting Thomas as an incredulous or habitually doubtful person, while Random House defines it as a person who refuses to believe without proof. But does that really describe the Thomas that we read about in the Gospel? Because Thomas has as proof the eyewitness testimonies of the disciples who had been present when Jesus appeared. Now that's proof if there ever was proof. People see something and they tell you about it. That's proof of what's happened. If we were having a trial with a judge and a jury, they could all swear an oath and swear to the jury that they had seen the Lord risen with their own eyes. So that's proof, but it wasn't sufficient proof for Thomas. I think truly the best and most accurate definition of a Doubting Thomas, if we're going to really tie it back to the Thomas of the Gospel, is it's one who refuses to believe without direct personal experience. Because that's what Thomas wanted. He wanted to feel with his own hands, to touch the wounds of Christ, to see those nail prints. Now, last Thomas Sunday, I know this because I saved my homily and to make sure I didn't repeat it. Last Thomas Sunday, we talked about how Thomas serves as our witness for the resurrection. He's our proof when we have moments of doubt, because he did what we can't do, which is touch the wounds of the risen Christ. And he provided the proof so that we may be among those who are blessed because they have not seen but have believed anyway. And this is why the icon of Thomas in Slavonic is inscribed not the doubt of Thomas, but the belief of Thomas. Thomas's belief was special because it was born of direct personal experience. He touched and he tested much as we might if we were faced with a similar claim to investigate. As St. Augustine tells us, Thomas saw and touched the man and confessed the God whom he neither saw nor touched. By means of one, he believed the other, undoubtingly. Thomas answered and said unto him, My Lord and my God. But still, he gets this bad rap in the West as Doubting Thomas. So, who is this man? Who is this Thomas that we've co-opted as a symbol of skepticism across our culture? Because Thomas, we know from the Gospel, was no coward. He wasn't a shrinking violet. We read in the Gospel of John that when Lazarus had recently died, there was resistance among the apostles to go up to Judea because the Jews had already attempted to stone Jesus, and the plots that were being hatched against him were well known. And so many of the disciples didn't want to go up there. But it was Thomas who spoke and said, Let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas didn't have any doubt. He didn't have any fear about following Christ. We know from his life in later times that he was a great apostle to India, where he preached the gospel to the people of the subcontinent until he was martyred for that. According to legend, Thomas was a skilled builder and was asked to build a palace for the king. And indeed, there are still buildings in India which bear the influence of Greek architecture. And although the specifics of his ministry aren't preserved, the Syrian scientist and mystic Bar-Dassan reported in the 200 AD that there were Christian tribes in India that claimed to have been converted by Thomas and that had books and relics to prove it. And at the time that the Second Persian Empire was established around 225 AD, there were already bishops of the church in the east that were in northwest India that were active and engaged in missionary activity. He was martyred in India, and the site of his martyrdom was preserved even to the most recent centuries. But the real reason that I think Thomas gets sort of a bad rap and why we should look at Thomas as a true hero of the faith and not as a doubter is that confession that St. Augustine spoke of earlier, my Lord and my God. With these words, St. Thomas confessed the twofold nature of Christ, human and divine. As his earthly Lord, Thomas fell down before the man, but as his heavenly God, Thomas confessed his divinity. And that's no small thing, because we know that the first great heresy that would threaten to tear the church apart was because that horrible presbyter Arius was unable to hold the same faith as Thomas because he couldn't confess Christ as God. But Thomas had no doubts about that. He proclaimed, my Lord and my God. St. John Cassian says of Thomas, did he say what you say, that it was a man and not God? That it was Christ and not divinity? He surely touched the body of his Lord, but he answered that he was God. Did he make any separation between man and God? His words contain heavenly doctrine, his faith a divine lesson. This is how the fathers of the church see Thomas, not as some skeptic. Blessed Theophylact is even clearer when he talks about Thomas. He says, he who had been before unbelieving, after touching the body, showed himself the best divine. For he asserted the twofold nature and one person of Christ, by saying, my Lord, the human nature, and by saying, my God, the divine. And by joining them both, he confessed that one and the same person was Lord and God. You see, Thomas's confession in this gospel is much more than just the eraser of doubt. Thomas's confession is one of the first scriptural recordings of Christ understood as both man and God. What we call the doubt of Thomas was in fact his gift to each of us, not only proof of the resurrection through his touching, but his declaration of the nature of Christ, divine and human, the God-man, Jesus Christ. So, brothers and sisters, as we return to this liturgy, let us give thanks to God for the belief of Thomas, whose testing has served as our own proof of the resurrection, and whose declaration of both the humanity and divinity of Christ remains the sure anchor of our faith. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Christ is risen.
Indeed is risen.
Thanks for listening to Hill Country Homilies. For more information, visit St. Andrew Orthodox Church at www.st-andrew.church. And please join us again next week.